Welcome to Legal Soundings, the podcast from Harbor, where leaders from across the legal ecosystem chart the course for the business of law. Whether you're navigating change inside a law firm, leading legal operations in-house, or building the next generation of legal technology, Legal Soundings is where insight meets action.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Legal Soundings podcast. My name is Brooke Daniels. I'm excited to be your host today and also SVP Market Lead at Harbor Global. Today's episode is focused on working with dinosaurs and technology adoption in the legal industry. Right now, we are at a really exciting inflection point in legal where over the last 18 months, we've seen an acceleration in AI technology and adoption that's unlike anything we've seen in legal before. This includes unprecedented venture capital flowing into legal tech with the Legal Technology Fund, but also larger players. And we've seen massive rounds raised by companies like Harvey and Legora, as well as more established partners that we're used to also introducing their own AI capabilities. And beyond that, I think we can all acknowledge that the nature of technologies in law firms are also shifting, where now we're seeing much more engagement from lawyers who are driving technology decisions, bringing use cases to the table, and actually trying to engage with technology teams and IT around how innovation is introduced to serve their law firms. And so for the first time ever, it's this convergence of the business leaders with the IT leaders and also the lawyers actually coming together to embrace adoption. But with that being said, one of the conversations we have very frequently in market right now is around legacy technology debt. So legacy systems that may still be on-prem and the impact that that's having with accessing data, as well as fragmented data, processes that make it hard to access that data, and integration strategy. But beyond that, we're hoping to also expand today's conversation to think broader about technology debt to include culture, processes, and just general change management. So conversation point for today: if the technology is here, why is adoption already so hard? And what actually needs to change to make this work? That is what we are going to dive into today. And I'm excited to welcome our guest, Marcus East, and also Allan Lampkin. I'd like to introduce you to Marcus, who I've known for quite some time, and we're excited to have you on the show today. Marcus brings over 2 decades of experience in technology, including at Apple and Google. He is now a VP and GM of Digital Technology Solutions at Autodesk, and also author of the book, Working with Dinosaurs, that explores this theme of technology debt. And I'm also joined today by Allan, who is CTO at Harbor Global, but was also previously the CIO at Paul Hastings, a global law firm and MLaw 25 firm as well. So thank you both for joining today. Let's get into the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So Marcus, I'm going to come to you first, and maybe you could ground us a little bit in your experience and talk a little bit about what personally drew you to this topic around working with dinosaurs and technology debt, and then kind of build on what makes this moment that we're in right now different from previous waves of technology.
It's a great question, Brooke. So to answer the first part of the question, I've uniquely had an opportunity to work on both sides of the tech disruption equation, in that half my career has been in the companies creating the technologies that are disrupting the world, whether it was IBM when I started my career inventing the PC, or whether it was Google or Apple. These are companies that have disrupted the world through great tech innovation. But the other half of my career has been working in legacy brands that have been disrupted. So whether it was National Geographic or Marks and Spencer's, these are 2 much older organizations that have had to somehow navigate through the world that was created by the disruption. And so because I've been in both camps, it's given me a unique perspective, and I'm genuinely fascinated in how organizations and people embrace the power of technology whilst at the same time overcoming all of the challenges. And what's exciting about where we are today, I think, is that we have access to technology that is more powerful than it has ever been. You can go into Google Cloud or AWS and you can spin up incredible computing resources that could, in some respects, unlock limitless potential for you as an individual or for your organization. And yet still, many companies struggle to do even the most basic of things with technology. And so I think it's an incredible moment to be alive.
And Allan, I'm hoping you can build on that a little bit and share a lens from your legal experience, and maybe also build on, are firms really ready to meet this moment?
Yeah, I will say it's a great time from a legal perspective, right? I joined legal about 6 years ago, and I saw the transformation then that could occur, right? I mean, back then it was more transforming from kind of on-prem to the cloud. Cloud was very prevalent, and people have now made that transition. But I think this time with AI, it's even more exponential from that standpoint. I think it has a large impact. You see it across all the applications, and a lot of firms trying to race how to use it. Obviously, there's a lot of media hype that's fueling that. And so the managing partners feel, every firm feels like they're behind. The reality is they aren't. Everybody is still trying to find, how can you get really the proper, return on investment? And it's not cheap to invest in AI either, right? So there's a lot of firms really struggling of how to place your bets in the right place. And really, they're also struggling of how to get the lawyers to adapt. It's not as simple as deploying a tool as they're used to doing. And there's a lot of work that needs to go into it.
Absolutely, Allan. And you bring us to a really great point, because I agree. The firms, when you talk to firms, everybody feels like they're behind. I think there are very few, and Marcus, you may agree, even outside of legal, most people don't feel like they are nailing AI adoption and really getting the level of ROI that they expect out of these tools. So let's pivot the conversation to what's holding people back. So Allan, you've level set us that people aren't actually behind. A lot of it is media hype. Let's call it for what it is. But even for firms that feel like they should be seeing a broader adoption, more use cases, more throughput through the tools they have, what is holding people back? And Marcus, I'll come to you first, and maybe you can talk about how should we think about resistance in that concept of, I don't feel like I'm getting the value I should be getting out of these tools. And what do you think are the real constraints from realizing that value?
Yes, this is the $64 billion question, because for many years now, whether it was digital transformation or whether it was e-commerce back in the 1990s, we've seen wave after wave of transformation where the promise has been articulated incredibly well and people have been very excited about it. But the number of organizations that have been able to truly unlock competitive advantage and the return on investment has been relatively small. I was in London a couple of years ago at a conference for a very successful AI startup, and I was asked to talk about why it is that companies are struggling with AI and whether or not that would change. And my prediction was that only about 5% of investments in AI would actually deliver the benefits that the organizations were looking for. And a lot of people said, well, that just can't be the case. I was joined on stage by colleagues from Accenture, for example, and they were like, no, you're all going to make lots of money from investing in AI. Don't worry about it. But MIT, as all of you know, or hopefully some of your audience know, released a study last year that did actually suggest that only around 5% of those investments in AI were actually delivering the return on investment that was anticipated, which is not dissimilar to what we saw with digital transformation. And I think there are several reasons for that, but just to highlight the main ones, it's not about technology. And so many times when I meet a CEO who wants to talk to me about my book or wants to talk about digital transformation or tech transformation, they often lead with this idea that, look, we've spent $100 million on this new platform, and yet, and I won't stop them and say, the tech is very unlikely to have been the challenge here. The challenge is most likely to have come from either people, and that can be talent, number of resources, or simple attitude towards change, or it can be about the processes and the operating model that you've developed around the edges. And so, yes, tech is important, but in my book, I talk about technology simply being the foundation for successful transformation. And there are a number of other elements that are much more related to people, culture, and process than technology. And I feel that many organizations that are failing to unlock the return on investment are the ones who haven't sufficiently embraced the importance of culture, process, and operating model.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that front, right? The people, process, and technology it's really the three pillars to make it happen. So yeah, there's a lot to be considered in those.
Allan, I want to go deeper. I think you brought up some great points, Marcus, from a broader topic. Allan, maybe you can take that into legal specific and law firms, and potentially, if you'd like to expand, corporate legal departments as well. But when we think about that piece around, well, are we operationally set up to effectively adopt this type of technology, right? Do we have the right culture in place?
One thing I found that's really interesting and specific to legal is the people, the lawyers that are working at that. Like if you look at the skeptic scale, right? Like say an average person is, a 50 out of 100 scale on a skeptic scale. You take a lawyer, they're 90 plus, right? So they're at the top end of the skeptic scale. So you're already starting with someone whose job it is to analyze material, find the holes, litigate, and make that happen. So now you're trying to deploy something to somebody who's already a skeptic, right? So that's a difficulty from an organizational change management model just to begin with from that standpoint, right? So, but that said, what's really important about it is being able to, be data driven, right? Because again, you're appealing to the logic side. They're going to break apart any, subjective argument from that standpoint. So you have to be data driven, and you really need to show results and show changes from that standpoint. And if you can get the right change champion, so within an organization, you can't just blindly roll it out to everybody. It's not one size fits all or the same process for everything. You almost have to roll out by practice group, understand how that practice group works, what's the workflow, and not the way the workflow was, but it's really about what's the new workflow with AI. So you really have to have an AI-enabled workflow and change the way those processes are looked at, and start with the groups that are, most sort of tech forward, because there's a lot that aren't from that standpoint, and get those wins and find those change champions within the groups. And a lot of times, in legal, rainmakers are the people that bring in a large, amount of money for the firm, right? They're brought in as laterals and things like that. But those rainmakers can also be incredible change champions because they're very, autonomous. They're forward looking, and the reality is a lot of the people in the practice group look up to those figures as well. So if you can get the right people and organize and rally around them and get the right processes in place, then you can be a lot more successful from a rollout point of view. So you really have to look at that. And again, you have to look at the usage data. So if you're using a tool like Harvey or something, you can access the actual usage data, create Power BI dashboards, and you can actually show who's having success with it. What are the metrics behind it? And even on a per practice group basis, what are your practice groups that are using it the best and most effective? And then try and teach other practice groups from that. But it's really about getting into the data and the metrics to help drive part of that as well.
So is it fair to say that people in firms are maybe overestimating what technology will deliver and underestimating the organizational change required to be effective?
Well, I think they absolutely underestimate the organizational change. And I think those firms that are forward, like I was fortunate enough, we brought in someone that just focused on organizational change management, right? And that person actually sat between IT and our knowledge management practice, innovation practice. So and it really takes someone who understands the workflows too. And that's something that's different, is that you can't just have an IT person, an engineer, trying to explain to a lawyer how they should be doing their work. The lawyer is only going to respect someone who's been a lawyer in the past that understands the workflows and pieces. So I think it's very important to work with the knowledge management practice innovation team in conjunction with IT, in conjunction with an organizational change management person, to really orchestrate that and to work with each of the practice groups in the rollout of technology.
Yeah, and that's a huge point. And Marcus, I'll come to you in just a second if you want to add in here. But I think that's a huge point in legal, because a lot of technology teams will acknowledge that historically the bulk of the function has been focused on keeping the lights on, right? How do we keep the plumbing going? How do we keep security in place? How do we execute governance, right? All of those really, really critical and important functions of IT teams, right? Servers, desktops, all of those components, super critical. But that role is now evolving very rapidly, right? Because when we think about the key initiatives that are driving the adoption of technology, it's business intelligence requirements, right? It's process automation. It's tools designed to sit alongside the desktop of lawyers and actually enable them in their workflows. And so the way that IT teams have to show up and engage those stakeholders across the organizations looks and feels very different. And that also starts to touch on not just behavioral shifts, but that's upskilling of talent. That's also process shifts, right? Do we have processes in place to enable collaboration effectively between these teams because it looks a lot different than it used to. Marcus, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add on that aspect around the collaboration and silos and different teams needing to work different in this age of technology.
Yeah, it's a critically important point, Brooke. And in my book, I talk about some examples of where I've seen tech transformations done really well. And this idea of extreme collaboration is one of them, where organizations have to be comfortable creating cross-functional teams that pull the right mindset, so the champions that Allan talked about, that have the right technical skills, the right business knowledge, and the right experience, but also the ability to drive change and have those teams moving forward. Unfortunately, many organizations still have their talent trapped in these silos. And to be super successful with tech transformation, you've got to go cross-functional. You've got to break down those silos and embrace the power of collaboration. So I think it's an absolutely valid point.
Well, let's take that, since we're now on the topic around how we collaborate across teams. Let's go ahead and take that through to what we think of as traditional technical debt. The data and the integration, how systems talk to each other, because I think everyone will acknowledge now that when we think about wanting to leverage advanced AI and advanced technologies, everyone's looking for their competitive differentiation in those tools. And a lot of that comes from access to data, right? That specific data that lives in our organizations. And most companies, not just law firms, but this is broadly speaking, will acknowledge they still have challenges with their data, data quality, separate from data access, separate from building integration architecture and tools, et cetera, that aggregate and streamline the way those systems communicate in reusable ways, secure fashions, less code that lives in a developer's head, right? And more something that is configurable and can be transferred across the organization. And so let's talk a little bit about that technical debt and what organizations are dealing with. And I want to put it in the context as well of solutions. We don't just want to talk about the problems, but in the sense of how should we think about getting started to tackle some of it? Because I still think there's sometimes a misconception that it has to be big bang. Like I just have to come in and rip all of this out when I'm already dealing with cloud migrations. I'm already dealing with all of these requests. And so maybe put the context of those challenges on how we think about legacy technical debt in the scope of how can organizations get started.
So I'm happy to take this one first. And I think that it's a really exciting time to be driving this kind of tech change because the tools available to us are better than they've ever been before. We have tools that allow you to abstract away from the mess that many organizations have in their data architecture, whereby you can effectively create virtual data lakes and data repositories that then allow you to move forward and create an environment where you can actually get your AI models access to the data that they need. Sometimes the challenge is actually the data itself, getting to the data, and not necessarily the architecture and the tools and how that works. But fundamentally, I believe that there are solutions out there today that can help. And if I can just share a couple of interesting examples, one would be a very interesting project at the Lloyd's of London insurance market. So there's a 330-year-old organization that still uses the processes that were established, centuries ago. But here's what's interesting. Working in collaboration with Google, the Lloyd's of London insurance market built the world's first AI-driven insurance syndicate. I happen to know that because I was the person who took the first meeting with the CEO. So what was fascinating about that is that, yes, there's an organization that had access to lots of data in many, many forms. Not all of it was even digital. They had records going back hundreds of years. But they took the decision to build a solution that could handle that. And Key, as it's called now, KI, is responsible for billions of dollars of syndicate transactions every single month, and is a really great example of how you can do innovation if you pick the right partner. In this case, they picked Google and were able to be very, very successful creating a solution that allowed them to move past a lot of the legacy. I think another interesting example is that of the banks who are clearly struggling with lots of their legacy data. They've got systems, many of which still run COBOL, many systems still running on mainframes, but they've been able to put in place new layers of abstraction that have allowed them to deliver pretty good digital experiences to not only their customers, but to their frontline, because they've been able to invest in the tools and the technologies to allow them to do that. So if you were to ask me to distill it down to one simple recommendation, I would say it's really important to pick the right tech partner and to trust your tech partner to be able to actually give you access to the tools and the talent that you may not have in-house yourself. And that's potentially a controversial point, but I would make the point that somebody who's worked for Apple and Google and Autodesk, I would tell you that those companies have amazing tech talent and you can get access to it. You don't have to replicate it yourself, and you don't have to rely only on the talent that you have in-house.
Yes. I love that, Marcus. And obviously I may be a little biased, consider what we do at Harbor, but we would agree with that point, right? It's that intersection of where technology and that talent meets the road with those in-house processes, right? The in-house knowledge and expertise. It's very difficult when organizations are faced with so many specific strategic things they have to do to also layer in being experts, right? And all of these different technologies, and especially with the pace of change. So I would agree with you there at exploring how the technology, but also investing in supplemental skill sets can really build out, right, what organizations need to create solutions. Allan, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add on that from a legal specific lens. And thank you, Marcus, for picking banking and insurance, because those are also two highly secure industries, highly regulated, and so a lot of parallels with how we're thinking about legal.
Yeah, I think in legal, the data problem, it's a little nuanced, right? Because, since it's done the migration to cloud, which the reality is for legal, it's not really cloud, it's SaaS solutions, right? Where they're hosting their data in disparate systems. So whether it's, they're using iManage or NetDocuments for their document management system, or they're using Elite or Aderant for their financial data in their financial systems, right? And obviously everyone has O365 hosting all of sort of your email, and some have documents and things like that. So it's disparate in these different systems. So it really is up to the firm. So like Copilot, for example, obviously it has access to all of your O365 data. So a lot of firms are using that. It's unstructured, but that's fine. They're learning and they're doing training on that. But when it comes to you want to cross your document management system with your matter management system with your financial system, it's in different systems, right? So either, you do is what Marcus had mentioned, right? Is you have a lakehouse, right, where you've aggregated the data that's important, or there are technologies like MCP, which some of the providers are starting to open up API access so that a prompt engine can go, an LLM can go connect into those and do the query within that local system too, right? So there's a little bit disparate. Now, the other problem is with document management systems, well, we all know lawyers don't always like to use them and store their data, and that's obviously a general counsel problem of getting them to store all their client records there. But even at that, the labeling of what's the final version of a document, I closed a big M&A deal, what's the final version, and not the 50 versions before it and all that, right? It requires a team to go in and tag those, right? So that you know what it is, so that when you're doing document compares for a particular client, their previous deals, what the terms were, are we missing any terms, are we being consistent, that you're actually using the proper version of the document, right? So that's an area of legal that really needs to improve from that standpoint, and have processes in place to tag the latest version.
Yeah, let's keep building on this topic around data access. And I'm going to bring up one of my favorite data topics is around democratizing access to data. That's a big phrase. And if you're not familiar with it, what do we mean by democratizing access to data? Is really a conversation around how can data be shared with the right governance controls amongst the organization, all the way to an application level that makes it easier for specific groups throughout the organization to be able to consume that data in the way that it needs to be kind of served up for their specific applications to power use cases. And in that way, we can slow down bottlenecks that traditionally exist, where everything has to go through an IT group or one specific small part of the organization for access to that data. Lots and lots of challenges with that I'm sure we all are aware of, from speed to market, iterations, all the things, right, that make it difficult for different parts of organizations to get data. And I bring it up because sometimes I'm in conversations and we talk about democratizing access to data. And it's like, that sounds great, but our finance team would never open up our practice management system. And so how do we think about balancing right? The need for that speed, the need for this data to flow to these different groups to get the value we want to receive with perceived risk. And also, I want to take it further through this behavioral change, right? And change management that has to happen. How do we bring those things together to get the value and the benefits we really want to see?
Thank you. I think this is one of the really tricky questions, and I think it will, in many ways, come down to the leadership within the organization. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at a dinner in Manhattan with some partners from one of the country's top law firms. And it was very interesting to me. All of them were partners, and I was talking to them, not surprisingly, about AI. And one of the things that was very apparent to me was that in order to get that company to be able to truly embrace the power of AI, you would need to persuade those partners that there is a different way in which their company is going to look in the future. You know, one of the pieces of pushback that I got about this idea of opening up the data and sharing all of the information was that, well, what does that do to our associates and our entry-level professionals? Then that's their job. You're going to put those people out of a job, and then we're going to end up with a pyramid that doesn't have a base. So there was a really interesting, I guess, pushback and fear about how changing the operating model within the organization could actually undermine the company. I think what it takes is bravery from those managing and senior partners who perhaps believe that this change is necessary, that you've got to democratize access to data, you've got to change the way in which you work, to really drive their partners and the senior people within their companies to do so. In this particular case, it was a super interesting conversation because I think my sense would be many of those people are not going to make it. And so for the managing and the senior partners to think about, do we have the right leadership to actually navigate us through this change, is one of the things that must have been front of mind for them. And if I think about the transformations that I've led in the past, one of the things that I've had to accept, and it's not a nice message, is that sometimes you do need to bring in some new talent or some additional talent in order to unlock some of the changes that you're trying to drive. And so I do agree with you that democratizing access to data, democratizing access to systems is important for organizations that are going to realize the full return on investment. But it's really hard to do if you don't have people who believe in that at the top of the organization driving it. May I share another quick anecdote then? So it's very interesting that many years ago I was back in London talking to a radiographer friend about the use of AI, and their belief was that it was going to have a very negative impact on radiography, and that using machine learning to look at X-rays would ultimately lead to bad outcomes for the experts who'd spent their careers becoming the best in the world at doing that. But here's an interesting fact. Since then, the advent of AI in radiography has been pretty successful. It's now deployed extensively, and you can imagine X-rays do lend themselves well to being analyzed by machine learning, and more sophisticated forms of AI can even take it a step further and start to really deduce some quite interesting outcomes. But here's what's fascinating. The number of radiographers being hired in the United States has massively increased as a result of those investments in AI. And the reason for that is that 10 years ago, radiography was not that profitable because it was quite people intensive. Today, radiography is considerably more profitable than it was because one radiographer using the power of machine learning can now do so much more work so much more quickly. And because the hospital systems and the insurance companies that are responsible for running healthcare in the United States have realized this, they've started to hire more radiographers because it's now become one of the most profitable ways in which you can deliver healthcare services. And it's an entryway into other services in that these radiographers are the ones spotting other more serious conditions that then lead to follow-on business. And so sometimes we can fail to see the potential because we're too focused on the short-term impact. And I think the legal industry is one where that is to be the case. Yes, I understand that people are very worried about the impact on entry-level jobs and being potentially commoditized. But my belief is that if you make attorneys more efficient if you make them more profitable because they can potentially squeeze more hours out of the day and do more work, I think that's a huge benefit for the legal industry. And so I'm excited to see what we're talking about in 10 years' time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, if you can just improve a little bit, like you take realization, right? No firm is really realizing the full potential of their revenue, right? Because customers, they push back, or there's lower level tasks they're not willing to pay for and things like that, right? So if you could change and make those hours billable that are not billable today, even if you can do that a couple percent, but on a $2 billion, top line, that's a substantial amount of money that firms can convert, right? So I think you're absolutely right that if you can really tune in on the right part of your business that's not making the money today and make it profitable, that that can have a large impact from a legal perspective. And I agree, you don't always have the right people. I mean, we did a survey of many of the top law firms, and even the IT departments and the COOs and things like that had agreed that nobody said we had all the right people in the firm at this point, right? To make the transition and the transformations that need to happen. So yeah, it definitely is trying to find the right people to do that as well and find the right areas.
Yes, I love that. Talent is a huge one. And also that mindset, right? I almost feel like that plays into the working with Dinosaur aspect of this session around the mindset, right? Why is it that every time we think about technologies, we see it as a way to kind of cannibalize our work versus really leaning into the growth potential it could have? I think people want to capture that growth potential in legal markets, but it's still just that fear of the unknown and a really legacy business model that is finally at this place of disruption. It was similar, not as intense, when e-billing first emerged on the scene, and everybody thought e-billing was just the beginning of the end of the billable hour. I don't know if I'm happy to say when I see my legal bills, but for the industry, the billable hour is still alive and thriving and going up year after year. And so I think that's a great example, right, of technology being introduced that didn't have these shifts on the negative lens. So if I could recap that, Marcus, and maybe you want to add a soundbite, because one of my questions was around what was the biggest mindset shift that leaders can make right now. But I think that kind of is a huge mindset shift, right?
It is, absolutely. And so this idea that organizations really have to embrace that change and be super comfortable that we're going to have to really re-engineer our processes. And if I can just throw out another anecdote that has always fascinated me, when I was at National Geographic, there was an audience of fantastic journalists and creatives who were really geared towards these Pulitzer Prize winning type endeavors. And so they would spend sometimes years on an article that would be read by a relatively small number of people, but would get critical acclaim. And then as part of the transition that I helped to drive, those people in the press room were told, no, your job is to drive engagement and it's to drive advertising revenue. And one of the ways in which the CEO of National Geographic, Declan Moore, drove that change is working with me and my team to put in place a dashboard that showed every single piece of work that was being published, how much engagement it was driving, how much advertising revenue it was driving. And here's what was interesting. 25% of the journalists just said, I'm out. Like, this is appalling. This is not what I signed up for. That was sad, but that was, I guess, to be expected. 25% of the journalists absolutely loved it, because now when they went into work, they had a clear set of metrics that they could aim towards, and they could actually see how it would improve their careers. And then there were 50% in the middle who were like, okay, this has changed, this is okay, I can adapt to this change. And so I think organizations just have to accept that if you're going to be successful in a transformation, you have to get to grips with, and as I refer to them in my book, maybe unpleasantly, the people dinosaurs who are super resistant to change and not prepared to adapt to new operating models. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, National Geographic is today the world's #1 social media brand, and it delivers around 7 billion content sessions every month as a result of that digital transformation, which was hard fought. If it hadn't have gone through that transformation, National Geographic as we know and love it today may not still exist. It's a phenomenal example of where a strong leader can really push change into an organization and do the right thing in the long term.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that example, Marcus. And we are coming up on time, so I will go to our last question for today after a really, really good discussion. So thank you both for leaning in today. Allan, I will come to you first. And this is very big. These are big picture ending questions. But what's one belief about technology in legal that you think will look completely outdated in 5 years?
That's an excellent question. I would say, probably it's using technology everywhere, I think, is important. So the old, people tied to their laptop, tied to their files on their laptop, things like that. I don't think people are going to work like that anymore. It's going to be a fully collaborative environment, an environment where AI is analyzing all of your documents and materials. And you're going to be accessing everything that's out there, right? I think it really extends it further, and it takes you off your, what you're used to of firing up your laptop and using it. It puts you in a completely different paradigm. And, and that could be from your phone, or it could be from your tablet or something else, but you still have, all of your documents, all of your technology, and utilizing, and it's really about the way you work and perform your work every day. AI is going to be your assistant, right? It's right there next to you. It's doing a large portion of your work, and it's more of how do you feed it and keep that going from that side, and for you to be more strategic and to move up, right? I think all of the tactical day-to-days that you do, that all starts to go away, and you really need to be a thought leader from that standpoint. And you really have to be thinking at a much higher level in how you interact with your clients. You're a business consultant at that point, right? And many of the top billers, that's how they're looked at. They sit on boards. They evaluate risk. It's really a business consultant from that standpoint. And all of the tactical of, let's, do a patent write-up. Let's do, let's create a litigation summary or whatever it might be. That's the stuff that's all delegated from an AI standpoint. So it really shifts the mindset, and people need to bring up and not worry about the tactical anymore, and really live in more a strategic world from that standpoint.
So Marcus, coming to you, similar question, a little bit different, but fast forward, let's do 3 years. And what do you think will separate the firms that got this right from the ones that didn't?
Yeah, another great question, Brooke. I think that the firms and the lawyers who do this right are actually going to change their operating model and their modus operandi to truly unlock the potential of AI. And let me give you an example. One of my team, and this is quite an amusing example, was very excited one morning to come in. I'd been away on vacation, and when I'm on PTO, because I'm British, I don't answer email, I don't answer the phone, I'm gone. But, I run a multi-billion-dollar business, and so they needed to have a way of finding out, how I was going to answer things. This direct report of mine built a Marcus GPT and trained it up on all of the materials that they could find, public speaking I've done over the last 20 years, documents I'd sent, emails, etc. And then they were interrogating this GPT and asking it, what is Marcus likely to think about this? What would Marcus recommend in this particular situation? And amusingly enough, it was pretty accurate, and it allowed them during this period to get on and do their work. Just imagine in 3 years' time, lawyers who prepare for a trial, leveraging the power of AI to create versions of the defendants or versions of the people that they are potentially litigating against in order to help them optimize their performance. I think that's going to be the difference. I think some organizations will just do a great job of improving their productivity. Some organizations will re-engineer themselves in the way that we described earlier in this talk to make sure that they are truly unlocking unique potential that AI gives to them. And so that's what excites me, and I can't wait to see what the next few years bring.
Thanks for listening to Legal Soundings. Subscribe for future episodes. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Harbor's work across law firms and corporate legal departments, visit harborglobal.com.